Metas have been around since the very beginning of gaming. Every game has an optimal way to be played, whether it's min-maxing stats in an RPG or finding the quickest path through an adventure game. There is always going to be an objectively best way to play any game in regards to efficiency. If you find that optimal way to play fun or not is entirely down to preference. Similarly, any competitive game will have a meta attached to it. Characters, items, classes, and builds all have that perfect path to take, which teeters on breaking any game balance. There will always be the best healer, the best deck of cards to help offset RNG, and the best team composition. This isn't anything new. Sports have been using different positions and getting suitably skilled athletes to fill those spots since the beginning of time. It's just how balancing goes. There's a famous story in rugby of how a player named Jonah Lomu changed the way the sport was played. Back in 1995, during the semi-final game of the Rugby World Cup, New Zealand vs England, a young Jonah Lomu was playing the position of winger. Now, for those who don't know, a winger is typically fast, but not as strong as those at the front. But Lomu came in and changed all that.
He showed people what the future of the game could possibly be like.
He weighed an impressive 120 kilos of pure muscle, but was still able to sprint the entire length of the field, bulldozing anyone in his way down, making him unstoppable and forcing other teams to adapt to this new style of play, changing how rugby meta worked. And this is absolutely no different to how video games work. Someone will figure out a crazy new strategy, forcing copycat playstyles until some other change is made to compensate for it. On paper, perfect balance is kind of boring. Yeah, rock, paper, scissors is a fun way to decide who gets shotgun, but it doesn't exactly lead to interesting gameplay. Even games based off this style have variables to make things more exciting, like how Pokemon can learn more than just what their typing suggests they could. But there is a game worth mentioning that stat differences are so negligible, it doesn't affect the overall game, and that is Rocket League. It's a pretty big outlier considering the gimmick and fast-paced nature give it a perfect balance. The skill ceiling is limited only by the player and their abilities to perform maneuvers and outplay opponents. Rocket League proves perfect balance within a game is achievable given the right gimmicks and a level playing field for all players. It's safe to assume that when you pick up any new competitive game, you'll have no clue of how the deeper meta that exists within it works, and kind of just pick a character that looks fun to you. There's something to be said about this kind of innocence when starting your journey in a new game. It's not about who functions the best, but about how much fun they are to play or how cool they look to you. As skills and knowledge develops, picking up on the little nuances of how the game works starts to happen, and optimal strategies are born. This isn't to say that when you begin playing to a strict meta, suddenly all the fun disappears from a game, only to become a serious experience? Of course not. We play games because they're fun. Why not just be as good as you can in the process, right? Maybe it's my contrarian nature, but I'm of the opinion that you should play what's fun. Well, within reason at least. No one likes the person who picks DPS when there's no healer, forcing someone else to fill that role. But say in Overwatch, I believe if you're a skilled Lucio and an alright Ana, even though the meta calls for Ana picks, as of this video at least, you should pick the AoE healing speed demon because, well, if you're better with him, you're better with him. Don't force yourself to play something for the sake of a meta. And this attitude is one I think best suits competitive Pokemon. Now, Pokemon meta is a bit all over the place because there is the official VGC and unofficial Smogon rule sets. The Pokemon meta is controlled by rule updates rather than patches and reworks to certain things. Sure, every generation sees slight tweaks to moves, types, and even things like Mega Evolutions and Z-moves, but between generations things remain unchanged. That means metagames are controlled by outside sources. Like, for example, Smogon has their set tier list ranging from Ubers, overused, underused, rarely used, and never used, where Pokemon from below tiers can be used in above, but not the other way around. For example, Caesar is an overused tier Pokemon that can be used in OU and Ubers, but not in underused or lower. The official VGC rules state that any Pokemon outside of a few legendaries can be used, meaning very occasionally, a Pokemon outside the expected meta can rise through the ranks and take everyone by surprise. Perhaps the most famous example of this is Sage1 Park's Pachirisu in the 2014 VGC World Finals. It's an underdog story of a man using his absolute favorite Pokemon instead of what's considered a right pick, and caught his opponent off guard. And really, that's the beauty of playing off meta. When people are so used to playing against one certain style, they have no clue what to do when something out of left field is thrown in front of them. Not always, but often, when a pro player pulls off a game-changing tactic, it shifts an entire meta. Other times, it can be so drastic that adjustments to balance need to be made by developers. Back in the early days of Wings of Liberty era StarCraft 2, there was a play called the Archon Toilet, which sucked opponents' units with a mothership vortex and used high splash damage to inflict enormous amounts of damage. This move was so powerful and became so popular, it forced Blizzard to change how the vortex worked, until eventually removing it from the game in the next expansion, Heart of the Swarm. Tweaks to how certain things work in games through patches is now very commonplace, allowing a meta to change to how the developers want them to. An example of this is League of Legends. Currently there are 134 champions, and that sheer amount means it's impossible to keep the game anywhere near perfectly balanced. So every season, which basically acts as a major overhaul to how the metagame functions, Riot will decide on a meta they think all kinds of players will enjoy, from making tanks, assassins, marksmen to mages strong to give them their time to shine. Of course, playing against the meta Riot design can have its advantages. A lot of players won't really know how to deal with you, but as a rule, these are usually the ways they want the game to go. What about a game that doesn't get updates? Titles that sit with a dedicated audience, forever figuring out new techs and playstyles, evolving a balance and meta by what's discovered, not by an outside source. Enter Super Smash Bros. Melee, about to turn 16 years old. Melee has never once received an official update or patch to buff or nerf characters. In spite of that fact, it's still gaining viewership and a fan base at a phenomenal rate. It has served as a good lesson in how cracks and accidents in game design can lead to interesting ways to play. As the Melee community evolves, they find newer and more exciting text in the exploits of the game's mechanics. Because of this, even the tiers of who is and isn't viable has changed over time, which is undeniably incredible, given nothing to the game's code has changed. Unsurprisingly, this has made the skill ceiling almost unattainably high on the competitive side. Only a handful of people being able to execute frame-perfect inputs in high-pressure situations, but it's undeniable how incredible it is that a game can grow and mold different metas and even shift character balance with no patches. Metagames are fun. Watching developers push and pull balance to favor certain styles of play is always exciting. It can be a bit of a punch to the gut if they hurt what you favor, but on the flip side, it's always good to try new things, never getting stuck in a rut. And really, that's why these days developers are always changing the rules, stats, and putting tweaks on everything, because they want players to enjoy the things they create. So if something isn't getting enough love, that can be changed externally. It doesn't always work and players can resist the change, but at the end of the day, experimentation with styles is what's healthy for a lot of game communities. There needs to be a constant push and pull. It's what helps these communities grow. People root for, argue against, and debate their favorite team, race, character, what have you, for hours on end in a display of loyalty. Balancing a game, any game, even those that aren't competitive, is not an easy task. It takes a lot of minor and major alterations to the formula. Even then, only a few games manage to find that balance of fun and fair. But when a good balance is achieved, solid strategies in the form of evolving metas emerge. It's always interesting to see what will happen next, either from players figuring things out or developers dropping a bomb and switching things up. Next time your favorite character gets nerfed into the ground, instead of getting upset, maybe see it as an excuse to try something new. Who knows, maybe an idea you come up with can change a meta.